The gun was still warm when Xinyu set it down on the conference table. Not because he'd fired it. He hadn't. It belonged to the man currently bleeding onto the marble floor of the 43rd floor boardroom, the man whose two bodyguards were pointing identical weapons at Shenyu's chest, waiting for the word. And the word, everyone in that room understood, would come from Liang Hao. Shenyu had not planned to be here tonight. He'd been in the building to photograph the atrium for his thesis, Transparency and the Architecture of Trust, because apparently the universe had a sense of humor. The security guard had waved him through at 9 p.m., the way they always wave through a kid with a student lanyard and a camera bag. He'd taken 37 photographs of the way light fell through the glass ceiling. He'd been on his way out when he'd heard the elevator open on the wrong floor. He'd gotten turned around. That was all. He'd stepped out looking for the lobby, and found instead a room full of men, who very clearly did not want to be found. Now he stood on the wrong side of a glass wall with blood on his shoes, and two gun barrels pointed at his sternum. And he was doing the only thing that had ever worked for him in situations that should have killed him by now. He was being honest. "I came in from the east stairwell," Xinyu said carefully, addressing the man at the head of the table. Liang Hao. He'd recognized him immediately, not from the news, but from the building itself. His name was etched into the lobby floor in steel lettering 3 centimeters deep. Liang Hao. Founder. The kind of permanence that wasn't a statement. It was a warning. "I wasn't looking for this room. I photograph architecture. I have the shots on my camera if you want to check the timestamps." No one moved. Liang Hao had not looked at the man bleeding on the floor since Xinyu walked in. He was looking at Xinyu. His face was the kind of still that Xinyu associated with load-bearing walls. Everything rested on it, and it did not shift. Dark eyes. A jaw that could have been designed with structural efficiency in mind. He was 30-something and dressed like money that had forgotten what it felt like to worry. And he was sitting at the head of a boardroom table, while someone bled out 4 feet away from him, as though this were a minor inconvenience in an otherwise manageable evening. The bodyguard on the left cocked his weapon. "Wait," Liang Hao said. One word. The bodyguard froze mid-motion. Shen Yu's heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his fingertips, but he kept his breathing even. Slow. His thesis supervisor always said he had an unnerving ability to go calm in a crisis. His thesis supervisor did not know what Xinyu's childhood had looked like, and Xinyu saw no reason to explain. "Your camera," Liang Hao said. Not a question. Xinyu unzipped the bag with the kind of measured, deliberate movement you used around dogs of uncertain temperament. He set the camera on the table, scrolled to the first photograph. The atrium at 9:04 p.m. glass ceiling. Long shadows. The precise, unhurried work of someone who had been paying attention to something other than this room. He slid the camera across the table. Liang Hao looked at the photograph for 4 seconds. Then he looked back at Xinyu. Something moved in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but the outline of a question forming where a verdict had been standing. "You go to Nanqing University," he said, reading the lanyard. "Final year," Xinyu said. "Architecture." "Final year," Liang Hao repeated, quiet. The man on the floor made a sound. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just the small, specific sound of someone realizing that the night was not going to go the way they planned. Xinyu looked at him. He was alive. Shoulder wound. He needed a hospital within the next 40 minutes, not because the wound was immediately fatal, but because it would become that way if no one did anything. Xinyu had taken enough first aid courses, required for fieldwork, required for doing site visits in buildings that hadn't finished being buildings yet, to know the difference. "He needs medical attention," Xinyu said. The room went very quiet. "That's not your concern," one of the bodyguards said. "You're right," Xinyu said. "It's yours. I'm pointing it out in case the observation was helpful." Someone across the table made a sound that might, under other circumstances, have been a laugh. Liang Hao's eyes hadn't left him. That stillness again. That load-bearing quality. Shen Yu had the sudden specific sensation of being read. Not the way people read resumes or faces, but the way you read a blueprint. Looking for the structure beneath the surface. Checking where the weight would fall. If I let you leave this room, Liang Hao said slowly, what happens next? Shen Yu thought about this honestly. He was good at honesty in the way that some people were good at mathematics. Not because it made his life easier, but because lying required remembering too many separate things, and he was already keeping track of enough. I finished my thesis, Shen Yu said. I have a review on Friday. My model is 30% complete, and I'm behind on the material analysis. He paused. I don't tell anyone about this room. Not because I'm afraid, but because I don't have anything useful to tell. I don't know what I walked into. You walked into something, Liang Hao said, that most people don't walk out of. I know, Shen Yu said, but you haven't made a decision yet. Which means something I said gave you a reason to wait. I'd like to keep giving you reasons. The silence stretched. Liang Hao leaned back in his chair. Looked at Shen Yu the way you looked at a building you hadn't designed and couldn't quite figure out. The structure was wrong for what it was supposed to be. But it was standing. It was standing and it shouldn't be, and that meant something. Get him a car, he said to one of the bodyguards. Take him to the street entrance. Shen Yu picked up his camera. Zipped his bag. The man on the floor, he said, because he could not help himself. Will be seen to, Liang Hao said. Shen Yu looked at him for one more second. Then he nodded, the way you nodded at a structural compromise that was imperfect but would hold, and followed the bodyguard toward the door. He did not know, walking out of that room, that Liang Hao would watch him leave with an expression no one in that boardroom had ever seen on his face before. He did not know that he was about to become a problem Liang Hao could not solve in any of the usual ways. He did not know, yet, that this was only the beginning. If this story already has you gripped, drop your city and country in the comments. We'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Chapter 1. The thesis review was in 4 days and Shen Yu had not slept. This was not unusual. Final year architecture students existed in a particular kind of suffering that professors described as character building and students described using words that were not appropriate in academic settings. Shen Yu's studio desk had accumulated 3 empty coffee cups, a half-eaten container of cold noodles, and 17 printed photographs of the Liang Tower atrium that he kept rearranging as though a different order would solve the structural argument his model refused to make. It would not. He knew this. The problem was not the photographs. The problem was that every time he looked at the glass ceiling in photograph number 11, the one taken at 9:17 p.m., after everything, he thought about a boardroom on the 43rd floor. About blood on marble that cost more per square meter than his monthly rent. About a man sitting at the head of a table like gravity was something that happened to other people. Shen Yu moved photograph 11 to the bottom of the stack. You're doing it again, said his roommate Lin Jie from across the studio, without looking up from his own drafting table. Lin Jie had an unsettling ability to narrate Shen Yu's internal states from a distance of 3 meters, which Shen Yu found both useful and deeply irritating. Doing what? The thing where you go quiet and rearrange papers and pretend you're thinking about architecture. I am thinking about architecture. Your left hand is doing the stress tap. Lin Jie finally looked up. He had the specific exhausted face of someone who had watched his roommate navigate crises with preternatural calm for 3 years, and had never once found it reassuring. What happened last night? Nothing. You came home at 11 with wet shoes and you stood in the kitchen for 6 minutes not making anything before you went to bed. I got turned around in the building. Which building? Liang Tower. Lin Jie set down his pencil. This was significant. Lin Jie did not set down his pencil during crunch week for anything below a genuine emergency. Shen Yu. I'm fine. You said Liang Tower like it's a normal sentence. It is a normal sentence. It's a building. I was photographing the atrium for my material transparency section. Shinyu picked up photograph 11 again, looked at the quality of light through the glass panels, set it back down. The atrium is excellent. Very good use of diffused natural illumination through structural glass. I'm going to cite it in my introduction. Lin Jie stared at him for a long moment with the expression of a man doing calculations he didn't like the results of. Then he picked his pencil back up and said, in the tone of someone choosing not to open a door, "Okay." Shinyu appreciated this about Lin Jie. He knew which doors not to open. He worked until 3 in the morning. He did not think about the 43rd floor. He did not think about the way a single word, wait, had stopped a cocked gun the way a load-bearing column stopped a collapsing ceiling. He did not think about dark eyes reading him like a blueprint. He turned photograph 11 face down and worked on his model instead. The message came at 10 a.m. the next day. Shen Yu was in the university's fabrication lab, cutting acrylic panels for his scale model with the focused, meditative attention that physical making always brought him. The lab smelled like laser-cut material and machine oil. Bright workbenches, cluttered shelves, the familiar background noise of other students building things. This was his best environment. He was good at making. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He looked at it. Set it face down. Kept cutting. It buzzed again. Same number. He finished the panel he was cutting, set down his tool, and picked up the phone. Your material analysis has a miscalculation on the load distribution in the east facade. The glass panels you've specified cannot carry that load under thermal expansion. You'd know this if you'd looked at the engineering documents, which are public record on the city planning portal. LH. Shenyu read this message 3 times. Then he set his phone down very carefully on the workbench, the way you set down something unexpectedly heavy, and looked at the acrylic panel he'd just cut. He thought about how, in buildings, the most dangerous failures were not the dramatic collapses. They were the quiet miscalculations. The things that looked fine until suddenly they didn't. He picked up his phone and typed back. How did you get this number? The response came in 40 seconds. You left your student information form with the security desk when you signed in last night. Standard visitor log. Shenyu looked at this. You read my visitor log. I read everything that comes through my building. You own the building. Yes. Shenyu thought about this exchange. About the fact that Liang Hao, founder, owner, man who had watched someone bleed with the detachment of a person for whom this was not the first time, had apparently, at some point in the last 12 hours, looked up the public planning documents for a final year architecture student's thesis project and identified a structural miscalculation. He typed, "Why?" A longer pause this time. 45 seconds. Almost a minute. The east facade argument was interesting. It was wrong, but it was interesting. Most people doing glass transparency studies don't think about thermal load at all. Shinyu read this twice. Something about it felt oddly like being handed a piece of information he hadn't asked for, and wasn't sure what to do with. A concession. Not a compliment exactly. Wrong was not a compliment, but something in the architecture of the sentence felt like one. He typed, I'll check the engineering documents. Good. And that was it. No further messages. Shinyu put his phone in his pocket and went back to his acrylic panel, and tried to remember what he'd been doing before the world had quietly reorganized itself around him without asking permission. The engineering documents were, as stated, public record. Shinyu found them that evening, sat at his desk in the studio with his laptop and the planning portal and 3 hours of his remaining life, and went through every document related to the Liang Tower's east facade structural system, with the focused unhappiness of someone discovering that they had been wrong about something they should not have been wrong about. The thermal expansion coefficient. He'd used the standard glass value. He hadn't accounted for the specific panel dimensions, creating a higher differential load at the anchor points under temperature variation. It was the kind of mistake that a working engineer would catch in 5 minutes. It was the kind of mistake that a student rushing to meet a deadline made at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday. He fixed it. Reworked the calculation. The corrected numbers actually strengthened his central argument. The east facade worked better than he'd thought, not worse, which was almost more annoying than being simply wrong. He sat back, looked at the corrected document. Then he opened his messages and typed to the unknown number. You were right. Fixed. The corrected load distribution actually improves the argument. He stared at what he'd typed. Considered deleting it. Sent it anyway because it was true, and he didn't see the point of not saying true things. This time the pause was almost 3 minutes. I know. That's why it was worth mentioning. Shen Yu looked at this message for a long time. Outside the studio window, the city was doing what cities did at midnight, existing at reduced volume, lights and movement without the daytime density. He thought about glass buildings and what it meant to build something meant to be seen through. Transparency as architectural intention. The willingness to be looked at. He thought about a man who read building documents and visitor logs and apparently also, somehow, undergraduate thesis projects at some point between running, whatever it was he ran on the 43rd floor and whatever happened after. He did not type anything else that night. The message 2 days later was different. Not a text. A formal letter, printed on paper that had a specific weight and texture that Shen Yu's fingers recognized as expensive before his eyes finished reading the letterhead. Liang Holdings Graduate Architecture Fellowship. Annual Award. 1 recipient. Full thesis production funding, access to the Liang Tower Technical Library, and a sponsored review panel including 1 industry representative. Shen Yu read the letter standing in the architecture department's main corridor where the administrative assistant had handed it to him with an expression of barely contained excitement, because the Liang Fellowship was not something that happened to second-tier public university students in their final year, and everyone in the department knew it. The application deadline was in 3 days. At the bottom of the letter, below the formal text, in handwriting rather than print, someone had written 4 words. The East Facade Works. Shen Yu stood in the corridor for a long moment. Students moved past him. Somewhere down the hall someone was having an argument about cantilever tolerances. The fluorescent light above him buzzed at a frequency that had been bothering him for 2 years. He folded the letter carefully. Put it in his bag. He told himself he would think about it. Whether to apply. Whether it was a good idea. Whether accepting anything from a man who existed in the specific category of person you had accidentally witnessed committing what was probably a crime was architecturally sound, in the metaphorical sense. He told himself all of this very reasonably. He submitted the application that evening. The review was on Friday. His panel included, for the first time in the department's recent memory, an industry representative. Shen Yu walked into the review room at 9 a.m., set his model on the presentation table. Adjusted the east facade panel, which now sat correctly in its frame, load distribution recalculated and reinforced, the glass panels specified to the right tolerance. The panel of reviewers filed in. His thesis supervisor. 2 faculty members. And at the end of the table, unhurried, occupying space the way buildings occupied space, with the quiet certainty of something that had decided to exist there permanently, Liang Hao. He looked exactly the same as he had in the boardroom. Of course he did. People like that did not look different in different rooms. The room changed around them. His eyes found Shen Yu immediately. Shen Yu thought, I fixed the east facade. Then he thought, this is a terrible idea. Then his supervisor said, whenever you're ready, Shen Yu. And Shen Yu turned to his model and began to present, because he was a final-year architecture student with 4 days of no sleep and a thesis review to survive, and whatever else was happening, this was still the work, and the work was the one thing he always knew how to do. He presented for 22 minutes. Clean, structured, confident. The corrected load analysis held. The transparency argument landed. When he reached the east facade section, he did not look at the end of the table. When he finished, the room was quiet in the way that meant something good. The east facade analysis is notably strong, said the industry representative, reading from the document in front of him, his voice entirely even. particularly the thermal load correction. It shows a mature understanding of real-world structural behavior. Shen Yu looked at him then. Could not help it. Liang Hao was looking back. That same quality of stillness. That load-bearing patience. Thank you, Shen Yu said. And meant, at least partially, something else entirely. Chapter 2. The fellowship came with a keycard. Shen Yu discovered this when the formal acceptance packet arrived at the department office on Monday morning. Thicker than the application letter, heavier, the kind of envelope that understood its own importance. Inside, the official fellowship agreement, a schedule of access privileges, a technical library membership card, and at the very bottom, a black keycard with a silver edge and the Liang Holdings logo embossed in the corner. No explanation of what it opened. He asked the administrative assistant. She didn't know. He asked his thesis supervisor, who looked at the keycard with the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by things that happened around exceptionally promising students, and said, "I imagine you'll find out." Shen Yu put the keycard in his jacket pocket and went to the library. The Liang Tower Technical Library was on the 31st floor, not the 43rd. Shen Yu noted this. He noted it the way you noted the difference between a structural wall and a partition. Technically separate, practically significant. The 31st floor was accessible, designed to be accessed, full of natural light and clean sight lines, and the specific organized calm of a space that had been built to make thinking easier. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Long drafting tables. A digital archive terminal that, when Shen Yu sat down at it and entered his fellowship credentials, opened into a technical document database so comprehensive that he sat for a full minute just reading the index. Engineering specifications. Material testing reports. Architectural drawings for every Liang Holdings development going back 18 years. Structural calculations with full methodology notes. The kind of documentation that firms spent years accumulating and never shared, because sharing it meant showing your mistakes as well as your successes, and most companies did not want anyone looking at their mistakes. These documents included the mistakes. Shen Yu found a report from 12 years ago, a residential tower where the foundation specification had been under-engineered on the initial design, caught during construction review, corrected before a single floor was built. The report included the original error, the correction, and a 3-page analysis of what had caused the miscalculation, and how the review process had been changed to prevent repetition. He read all 3 pages. Then he looked up at the ceiling of the library, glass panels, diffused light, the even distribution of illumination that made the room feel both open and contained, and thought about a company that kept its own failure reports. That documented the thing that went wrong and the reason it went wrong, and the system built to make sure it didn't go wrong the same way again. He pulled up another document. Started reading. He was still reading 4 hours later when a voice said, "You're in my chair." Shen Yu looked up. Liang Hao was standing at the end of the drafting table in a charcoal jacket with no tie, which was apparently the closest he came to casual, holding a coffee cup and looking at Shen Yu with that expression Shen Yu was beginning to recognize. Not quite amusement, not quite assessment, something that lived between them and refused to choose. "There are 12 other chairs at this table," Shen Yu said. "I'm aware of how many chairs there are at this table. Then you have options." A pause. Then Liang Hao pulled out the chair 2 seats down, set his coffee on the table and sat. He opened the document folder he'd carried in, and began reading without further comment, and Shen Yu, after a moment, turned back to his own screen. They worked in silence for 11 minutes. Shen Yu timed it without meaning to, because silence with other people usually had a texture, anticipatory or uncomfortable, or the strained kind that was really just an argument taking a breath. This silence was different. It had the quality of 2 people in a shared workspace who understood that the other person was also doing something real. He found he didn't mind it. "The failure report from 2013, Shen Yu said, because he couldn't not. "The foundation specification. Why is that in the accessible archive?" Liang Hao didn't look up. "Because it happened." Most companies don't document their mistakes in a database that fellows can access. Most companies are more interested in how they look than what they learn. Shen Yu looked at his screen. The 2013 report was still open, the correction methodology neat and thorough, the kind of work that required someone to sit with a failure long enough to actually understand it instead of just fixing it and moving on. Who wrote the methodology section? Shen Yu said. The correction analysis. It reads differently from the technical specifications. Now Liang Hao looked up. Something shifted in his expression, small and quickly controlled. What do you mean, differently? The technical sections are precise. Engineering language, standard format. The methodology section is, Shen Yu searched for the right word, personal. Like someone was actually angry about the mistake. Not at the engineers. At the fact that the system had allowed it. A longer pause this time. I wrote it, Liang Hao said. Shen Yu nodded slowly. Filed this away in the part of his mind that was building a structural diagram of the man 2 seats down. Not intentionally, but he did this with everything. It was an occupational formation, looking for load paths and stress points and the places where weight actually lived. How old were you? Shen Yu said. 26. That's young to be angry at systems. It's the right age for it, Liang Hao said. You're still convinced the system can be fixed. Later you just work around them. Or you build better ones, Shen Yu said. Liang Hao looked at him. That reading a blueprint quality again, thorough and unhurried. Yes, he said after a moment. Or that. It became a pattern. Not one they discussed. Not one that was established with any intention on either side, or at least none that Shen Yu acknowledged to himself. But on Tuesday, when he came to the library at 10 in the morning, Liang Hao was already there, in the chair 2 seats down, with a coffee cup and a document folder. On Thursday, Shen Yu arrived to find the terminal already logged into the archive, his fellowship credentials pre-entered by someone who'd gotten there before him and apparently decided to be useful about it. On Friday, there were 2 coffee cups on the table when he arrived, one already empty, one still steaming. Shen Yu sat down, wrapped his hands around the warm cup, did not say anything about it. Liang Hao, across the table and reading something dense with financial annotation, also did not say anything about it. They worked. Occasionally one of them said something. About documents, mostly. About structural decisions and why certain materials had been chosen over alternatives, and what the wind load data had looked like the year the North Tower's glass specification was finalized. Liang Hao knew the buildings the way Shen Yu knew his own model. Not just the finished surfaces but the thinking underneath, the reasoning that didn't show in the final product. Shen Yu found this unreasonably interesting. You know every project, Shen Yu said on Friday, halfway through his coffee. I was on site for most of them. You're the CEO. I was on site before I was the CEO. Liang Hao turned a page. I didn't start at the top. Where did you start? Site surveyor. 18 years old. Spent 2 years measuring things other people would build, and thinking about everything I'd do differently. Shen Yu looked at his screen and thought about this. About 18 years old and a measuring tape and the specific hungry attention of someone who was learning by looking, before they had the power to do anything with what they saw. Then what? Shen Yu said. Then I found the funding. For which project? For all of them. Liang Hao's voice was even factual, the way it always was when he said things that should have been significant, and instead just sounded like information. I was 22. I had one investor, one site and specifications I'd written in a notebook over 2 years of measuring other people's buildings. Shen Yu turned in his chair. Just slightly. What was the first building? Liang Hao finally looked up from his documents. He studied Shen Yu for a moment, that thorough, unhurried assessment, and then he turned to the digital archive terminal at his end of the table and pulled something up. Turned the screen toward Shen Yu. A small commercial building. Clean lines, minimal ornamentation. The glass facade specified with a care for light distribution that was immediately recognizable to anyone who'd looked at the east facade analysis long enough. Efficient. Honest about what it was. Built like something that intended to last. 2009, Liang Hao said. 6 floors. Nothing remarkable. Shen Yu looked at the building for a long time. It's remarkable, he said. A silence. It has the same glass logic as the tower, Shen Yu said, leaning forward slightly. The way the panels are anchored. The thermal consideration at the corners. You already understood it at 22. I'd been thinking about it since I was 18. Liang Hao's voice had shifted, fractionally. Something underneath the flatness that wasn't quite pride. Something older than pride. Like someone who had carried a thing a long distance and was setting it down to look at it, just for a moment, before picking it back up. Most people don't want to hear about 18 years of thinking. They want to hear about the result. I want to hear about the thinking, Shen Yu said. The library was quiet around them. Outside the windows, the city sat 31 floors below in its usual afternoon state, movement and density, and the particular visual complexity of a skyline that had been built by 100 different people with 100 different ideas about what a building should be. Liang Hao looked at Shen Yu for 3 full seconds. Then he pulled the screen back toward himself and turned it off. Friday afternoon, he said, standing. He picked up both empty coffee cups with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to clean up after himself long before he had people to do it for him. The library closes at 6. I know when the library closes. You've been here since 10. I'm aware of how long I've been here. Something crossed Liang Hao's face. Brief, reluctant, immediately disciplined. The structural outline of a smile that had decided not to happen. He walked toward the door. Stopped. Turned back with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was already questioning it. There's a site visit tomorrow morning, he said. New development. East District. The structural glass specification is relevant to your thesis argument. He paused. The lead engineer will be there. She's better at explaining thermal load than any document in this archive. Shen Yu looked at him. Are you inviting me to a site visit? I'm informing you that one is occurring. That's the same thing. It is not the same thing. The practical outcome is identical. Liang Hao was quiet for a moment. Something about the quality of the silence felt like a man standing on a floor he wasn't certain would hold his weight. 8 a.m., he said. East District. The address will be sent to your fellowship contact. He paused again, and the pause had a texture Shen Yu couldn't quite name, something careful and deliberate, like a structural calculation being run one more time before committing. Wear real shoes. It's a working site. He left. Shen Yu looked at the empty chair 2 seats down. At the 2 coffee cups Liang Hao had taken with him. At the terminal still open to the archive, his own fellowship credentials glowing on the screen. He thought, this is probably still a terrible idea. Then he thought, the East District site has a glass specification I haven't seen. He wrote down the fellowship contact information, put on his jacket, and went home to find his site boots. He didn't tell Lin Jie where he was going in the morning. Not because he was hiding it. Just because there was no version of the sentence I'm going to a construction site with the CEO of Liang Holdings, who I technically witnessed in a room where someone got shot that ended with Lin Jie setting down his pencil and saying great, sounds fine. So instead he said, site visit. Fellowship thing. And Lin Jie said, which meant he didn't believe this was the whole sentence but was choosing, again, not to open the door. Shen Yu put on his site boots and thought about the first building. 2009. 6 floors. The glass logic already fully formed at 22, in the mind of someone who had spent 4 years measuring other people's buildings and thinking. He thought about 18 years old and a notebook and the specific quality of attention that looked at something, and already understood what it should have been instead. He thought about this longer than was probably necessary. Then he checked the address that had arrived in his fellowship inbox at 11:47 p.m., late enough that the sending of it had clearly not been impulsive, and went to find out what the East District's glass specification looked like. Chapter 3. The site was loud in the specific way that working construction was loud, not chaotic but layered. The rhythmic percussion of something being fastened at height, the lower sustained note of machinery, voices calling measurements across open floors. Shen Yu stood at the site entrance at 7:58 a.m. with his hard hat tucked under his arm, and his site boots already picking up red clay from the ground, and felt the familiar settling that happened to him in unfinished buildings. Finished buildings were performances. Unfinished ones were honest. He could see the steel frame rising against the morning sky. 12 floors currently, with the ghost of 8 more in the column spacing. The east face was already receiving its first glass panel installation, a crew working with the careful, unhurried precision of people who understood that speed was not the point. The point was the gasket seal. The point was the anchor tolerance. The point was the 4mm gap that would make the difference between a panel that breathed correctly through temperature change and one that cracked in its third winter. Shen Yu looked at the gap and felt the specific satisfaction of seeing a thing done right. "You're on time," said Liang Hao, appearing at his left shoulder with no preamble, in a hard hat and a jacket that had clearly been on construction sites before. Worn at the elbows, a dried concrete mark on the left cuff that dry cleaning had failed to fully erase. "You said 8. Most people interpret 8 as 8:10. That's their problem." Liang Hao looked at him with that expression. The not-quite smile that lived in the architecture of his face, without ever fully committing to existence. He handed Shen Yu a site safety vest, orange, slightly too large, the kind that lived in a bin by the site entrance, and had been worn by 100 people before. "The lead engineer is on the 4th floor," he said. "She wants to talk about the anchor bracket design before the morning pour." "What's being poured?" "Secondary foundation for the service core. It's not relevant to your thesis." "Everything is relevant to my thesis." "The service core foundation is not relevant to your thesis." "The relationship between service core placement and facade load distribution is directly relevant to my thesis." A pause. Liang Hao tilted his head fractionally. Something moved in his expression. Not concession exactly, but the structural equivalent of it. An acknowledgement that the load path was not where he'd assumed. "Fine," he said. "We'll go to the 4th floor first." The lead engineer was Dr. Feng Wei, 53 years old, with the particular physical authority of someone who had spent 30 years on working sites, and had long since stopped having any patience for people who hadn't. She was crouched over a bracket assembly when they arrived on the 4th floor, a tablet in one hand and a torque reading in the other, and she looked up at Shen Yu with the assessing speed of someone who sorted people into categories quickly and rarely revised. "Fellowship student," she said. "Final year. Shen Yu. Your thesis is on transparency and structural glass. Material transparency, and what it implies about architectural intention." She looked at him for one more second. Then she looked at Liang Hao. "He can stay." Liang Hao said nothing, which Shen Yu was beginning to understand was his version of "I told you so." Dr. Feng stood and walked them to the east face, where the morning's first panel was suspended in its rigging, waiting for the anchor crew to finish their pre-installation check. Up close, the panel was larger than it looked from the ground. 2 meters by 3, the glass a specific low-iron formulation that Shen Yu had read about in the archive but never seen in person. "Touch it," Dr. Feng said. Shen Yu looked at her. She nodded toward the panel. He reached out and placed his palm flat against the surface. The glass was cold in the morning air, but the cold was even, distributed, consistent, without the pressure differentials you felt in cheaper specifications where the thermal mass wasn't uniform through the panel depth. He moved his hand to the corner, to where the anchor bracket would contact the edge, and felt the slight change in temperature where the frame element met the glass. "The bracket material," he said. "It's not steel." "Structural aluminum composite," Dr. Feng said. Lower thermal conductivity. Reduces the differential at the contact point, which reduces the stress concentration under temperature change. She confirmed, with the tone of someone who had just decided that she'd been right about the category she'd put him in. Most people don't feel that with their hand. They read it in the specification sheet and understand it intellectually. You felt it. Shen Yu took his hand off the panel. Looked at the corner anchor detail. I've been thinking about this corner for 3 weeks. In my model, the thermal behavior at the anchor point was where the original load miscalculation lived. I heard about the miscalculation, Dr. Fong said, with a look at Liang Hao that contained a full conversation Shen Yu wasn't part of. Liang Hao was looking at the panel. Show him the bracket assembly, he said. The full sequence. That'll take an hour. His next class is at 2. Shen Yu looked at Liang Hao, who was still looking at the panel and not at Shen Yu, which meant he had checked Shen Yu's class schedule at some point, which meant the fellowship access included student timetable information, which was fine, normal, probably standard. The fellowship representative would naturally have access to the fellow's academic schedule. He filed this away in the structural diagram that was getting more complex and said nothing about it. An hour is fine, he said to Dr. Fong. The hour became 2. Dr. Fong was the kind of teacher who operated through demonstration. She did not explain things and then show them, she showed them and let the explanation come from the looking. She walked Shen Yu through the entire east facade bracket sequence, from the primary structural connection at the steel frame through the thermal break element to the glass contact point, and she answered every question he asked with the direct, unadorned precision of someone who had no interest in making things sound more complicated than they were. Liang Hao stayed. He didn't participate in the teaching. He stood slightly back, reviewing something on his tablet, occasionally looking up when a technical point was made. But he stayed, and Shen Yu was aware of it the way you were aware of a structural column in a room. Not obtrusive. Just load-bearing. At one point Dr. Fong walked Shen Yu to the building's north face to compare the bracket specification. A different assembly on this face, an older design from the original tender document that hadn't been updated before construction began. This one concerns me, she said, showing Shen Yu the contact detail at the corner. It'll pass building regulation. But in 15 years in the 3rd or 4th thermal cycle, we'll see microcracking at this point. Has Liang Hao seen this? He's looking at it right now, she said. Shen Yu turned. Liang Hao was crouched at the north face corner, one hand on the bracket assembly, examining it with the focused attention of someone who had felt the same temperature differential Shen Yu had felt and was running the same calculation. He straightened. Looked at Dr. Fong. Update the specification. It'll add 2 weeks to the north face installation. Update it. Dr. Fong made a note on her tablet without expression. This was, Shen Yu understood, not an unusual exchange. This was how decisions were made here. Someone saw a thing that wasn't right, said so, and the person with the authority to fix it fixed it. Without deliberation. Without weighing the cost of the 2 weeks against the cost of the microcracking 15 years from now, as though these were equivalent concerns. He thought about the 2013 failure report. The methodology section. Someone angry at the system, at 26, for letting a mistake get that far. You always update it, Shen Yu said to Liang Hao, quietly enough that only he could hear. Liang Hao looked at him. Yes. Even when it costs more. Especially when it costs more. He looked back at the north face. The cost of fixing a thing now is always less than the cost of fixing a thing after it's failed. Anyone who tells you otherwise is amortizing their problems onto someone else's timeline. Shen Yu looked at the bracket. At the microscopic gap between specification and right that would become a crack in 15 years and a failure in 20, and a cost borne by someone who hadn't built the building and hadn't made the decision, but would have to live with it anyway. He thought about this in a way that felt like it wasn't entirely about buildings. They walked the rest of the site after Dr. Fong, went back to the fourth-floor anchor crew. No agenda, no demonstration, just movement through the building's current state, which was the state Shinyu liked best. The moment between structure and surface, where the decisions were all still visible, and nothing had been covered over yet. Liang Hao walked the site the way Dr. Fong did, like someone for whom this was natural ground. He pointed things out without being asked, occasionally. A column spacing decision that had been adjusted from the original drawing. A stair core placement that looked suboptimal, until you understood the service routing below. "Why here?" Shinyu said at the stair core. "The original position was better for circulation." "The original position required relocating the main drainage stack," Liang Hao said, "which would have added 3 weeks and compromised the service zone on floors 2 through 6. So you moved the stair. A staircase is more flexible than a drainage stack." Shinyu looked at the stair core, then at the ceiling, imagining the drainage routing above, then back at the stair. "The circulation path from the lobby is longer now. By 4 meters. 4 meters is significant in commercial use. 4 meters is 4 seconds of additional walking time," Liang Hao said, "versus 3 weeks of construction delay and a compromised service zone. The 4 seconds was the right trade. Did you walk the route yourself before deciding?" A pause. 3 times, Liang Hao said. Shinyu looked at him. "You walked a hypothetical 4-meter extension 3 times. I walked the site at different times of day. Morning, midday, evening. Different movement patterns. Different crowd densities." He was looking at the stair core, not at Shinyu. A 4-meter extension in a morning rush feels different from a 4-meter extension at midday. The decision needed both. Shinyu stood in the unfinished building and thought about a man walking a route that didn't exist yet through a building that wasn't finished yet, 3 times at 3 different times of day, to understand what 4 meters would feel like to someone who hadn't been involved in the decision, and would never know it had been made. "Most CEOs don't walk hypothetical routes," Shinyu said. "Most CEOs didn't start as site surveyors." "Is that the whole reason?" "A beat." "No," Liang Hao said. He didn't elaborate. They stood for a moment in the stair core space, the open floors rising above them, morning light coming through the east face in the long specific shafts that would disappear once the interior partitions were built. This kind of light only existed in the middle of construction. This kind of honesty about a building's bones only existed before it was finished. "What will this floor be?" Shinyu said, looking up. "Serviced offices. Mixed tenancy. The light is good here. The light is always good on east faces. That's the point." Liang Hao looked up too. "You cited in your introduction. The east face of the tower. The way diffused light through structural glass creates a quality of transparency that implies openness without surveillance." Shinyu turned to look at him. "You read my introduction. The review panel receives the written document in advance. That was 3 days ago. I read things when they arrive. You read a student thesis introduction." "I read everything that." Liang Hao stopped. Something in his expression shifted. The flatness reorganized slightly, like a surface that had been leveled discovering it had a gradient. "Everything that comes through your building," Shinyu finished. "That isn't what I was going to say." "What were you going to say?" A longer pause this time. A construction sound from above filled it. Something being fastened, the clean final note of a torque wrench reaching specification. Then quiet. "I was going to say I read it because the argument was interesting," Liang Hao said. "The transparency as intention. The idea that building something meant to be seen through is a choice that implies something about the builder's relationship to being observed." He paused again. "I've thought about that argument for 20 years without having language for it." The light shifted. A cloud above the open building frame, moving across the morning sun, changing the quality of the shafts coming through the east face. Both of them watched it without comment. "The introduction is the weakest part of the thesis," Shinyu said. It gestures at the argument. The middle chapters are where the argument actually lives. I know, Liang Hao said. I read those too. Shen Yu looked at him. There was something in the quality of the moment that felt structural to him. A load that had been distributed across multiple points suddenly concentrating at one. Not heavy. Just present. Specific. The kind of thing you could not walk through a site at 3 different times of day and account for in advance. His phone buzzed. Lin Jie, you're not dead right. He looked at the message. Typed back. No, still on site. Lin Jie, which site? He put his phone in his pocket. I should check on the foundation pour, Liang Hao said at the same moment. He was already moving, which meant he had also just made a decision about the quality of the moment and decided to walk through it rather than stand in it. Dr. Fong will want a second sign-off before they start. I'll come, Shen Yu said. The service core foundation is relevant to my thesis, yes. That non-smile again. There and gone. Come on then, Liang Hao said. They walked toward the core, and Shen Yu looked at the east face as they passed. The new glass panel now fully installed, the aluminum composite bracket sitting exactly right at the corner, the 4mm gap maintained precisely through the anchor sequence, everything held to its specified tolerance. A thing done correctly, all the way through. He thought about how that was harder than it looked. How it required the same decision, made the same way, at every point along the installation sequence. How one person deciding to skip a step because it was cold and they were tired, and the gap was only fractionally off would undo the entire logic of the specification. He thought about walking a route 3 times before making a decision. He thought about 2013, and a young man angry at a system for letting a mistake get that far, writing 3 pages of methodology about how to make sure it never would again. He looked at Liang Hao walking ahead of him toward the service core and thought, I am building a structural diagram of this person, and I am not going to like where the load path leads. Then he thought, the north face bracket specification would have failed in 15 years, and he caught it by touching it with his hand. Then he stopped thinking about it, because the foundation crew was ahead, and Dr. Fong was already looking at them both with the expression of someone who had made her own structural diagram, and had reached her own conclusions about the load path. And Shen Yu had a thesis to finish and a very clear understanding of which decisions were sound, and which ones were made in buildings that weren't finished yet. In light that only existed in construction, before everything was covered over. He put on his hard hat and went to look at the foundation pour. That evening he added a new section to his thesis introduction. Transparency as architectural intention is not merely a statement about light and glass. It is a commitment made in the bones of a building before the surface exists. A decision about what will be visible and what will be covered, made at the moment when covering is still possible. The most honest buildings are honest before they are finished. The material choice precedes the observation. The builder decides to be seen through before anyone is watching. He read it back. Changed honest to legible in the second sentence, because honest was doing emotional work that legible did more precisely. Then he changed it back. He saved the document. Looked at the time, 11:30 p.m., and thought about a message that had arrived at 11:47 p.m. the previous week, late enough that its sending had clearly not been impulsive. He closed his laptop. Looked at the keycard on his desk, silver edge catching the light. Thought about 4 meters. About 3 times. About a bracket corner on the north face that would have cracked in 15 years and now wouldn't. He went to bed. His phone lit up at 11:52 p.m., unknown number. The foundation pour went well. The service core specification is solid. You were right that it's relevant to the thesis. The load path from the core to the east facade connects directly to your transparency argument. The structural honesty runs through the whole building, not just the glass. Shen Yu stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then he typed back, I know. That's what I've been trying to say. He put his phone face down and did not look at it again. He did not sleep for quite a while. Chapter 4. The thing about structural diagrams was that they didn't lie. You could misread them. You could apply the wrong assumptions and get the wrong answer. You could look at a load path and decide it went one direction when it went another. But the diagram itself, the actual distribution of weight and force and stress across a system, was just true. It didn't care about your interpretation. It sat there being accurate while you got it wrong around it. Shen Yu understood this about buildings. He was beginning to understand it about other things too. It had been 11 days since the site visit. In those 11 days he had been to the library 7 times. Liang Hao had been there for 5 of them. They had talked about the East District site 3 times, about the 2013 failure report twice, about a coastal development project from 2017, whose seismic specification Shen Yu had found in the archive, and read with the focused attention of someone studying a language they'd been trying to learn for years. He had also, in those 11 days, done the following: finished his material analysis chapter, corrected 2 more minor calculation errors that Liang Hao had identified without being asked, eaten a real meal 3 times because the library's second-floor cafe had food and Liang Hao had a habit of ordering things and leaving them on the table at approximately noon without comment. Lin Jie had noticed the meal thing. "You're eating," he'd said on Thursday, with the tone of a man noting a meteorological anomaly. "I eat. You eat crackers and cold noodles during crunch period." "I've been eating at the library." "The university library doesn't have a cafe." "The Liang Tower library does." Lin Jie had put down his pencil. Picked it up. Put it down again. "Shen Yu. It's a fellowship benefit." "Is it?" "The fellowship includes library access. The library has a cafe. These are sequential facts." Lin Jie had looked at him for a long time with the expression of a man choosing between 2 doors, and not liking either one. Then he'd said, very carefully, "Is the thesis going well?" "Very well," Shen Yu said. "Great," Lin Jie said. "That's great." And he picked up his pencil and said nothing else, which meant he had opened neither door, but had memorized where they both were. On the 11th day, Shen Yu arrived at the library to find it empty. Not Liang Hao at the other end of the table with a coffee cup and a document folder. Not the pre-entered terminal credentials. Just the room, clean and quiet and lit with its usual even diffusion, and a note on the table at the chair 2 seats down. Handwritten. The same handwriting as the east facade works. Site meeting ran over. Something to look at while you wait. Archive folder 7, project 23. The glass spec is unusual. I'd be interested in your read. Shen Yu looked at this note. Read it twice. Set it down. Thought. While you wait. Which assumed he would wait. Which assumed that being in the library without Liang Hao present was a state of waiting for Liang Hao rather than simply being in the library working on his thesis, which was a thing he could do entirely independently, had been doing for 3 years before any fellowship existed. He sat down at the terminal. Opened Archive Folder 7, Project 23. Then he forgot about the note entirely. Project 23 was unusual. It was a cultural center. 2015 Mid-City, a commission Liang Holdings had taken at reduced fee, because the client was a non-profit, and the site was in a district that hadn't seen significant development investment in 2 decades. This information was in the project brief, matter of fact, 1 line. Shen Yu noted it and kept reading. The glass specification was, as stated, unusual. Not in a showy way. Not the kind of unusual that was unusual because someone had wanted to make something look spectacular. Unusual because someone had thought very carefully about a specific problem. The building sat on the corner of 2 streets with different light conditions, the north face in near-permanent shadow from an adjacent tower, the south face in direct afternoon sun, and had solved it with a specification that Shen Yu had never seen deployed at this scale. Gradient density glass. The panels increased in opacity from south to north, calibrated to equalize the internal light experience across the whole building regardless of which face you were on. Standing inside, you couldn't tell which direction you were looking. The light was even everywhere. Shen Yu stared at this specification for a long time. He pulled up the load calculations. The gradient density panels had a different weight profile from standard glass. The density variation changed the structural behavior at the anchor points, required a custom bracket specification that was a direct evolution of the East District composite design he'd spent 2 hours learning from Dr. Fong. He pulled up the internal photographs. The finished building. He'd walked past it before. He'd walked past it and noted it, because he noted buildings, but he hadn't known it was a Liang project. Hadn't known why the light inside felt different from every other building on that street. Now he knew. Someone had solved for the light before the building existed, in the planning documents, in the glass specification, in a bracket design that no one who used the building would ever see. The solution was invisible. The effect was everything. He was still reading when Liang Hao arrived. "The gradient specification," Xinyu said, without looking up. "Good morning to you too," Liang Hao said, setting down a coffee cup at the 2 seats down position. "You equalized the light experience across the north-south differential. The gradient density was calibrated to the shadow study." "Yes. The shadow study is 47 pages. It took 8 months. Xinyu finally looked up. "You spent 8 months on the shadow study for a reduced-fee non-profit commission." Liang Hao sat down. Opened his folder. The building needed it. The budget didn't support it. The budget supported what the budget supported. The shadow study was separate. Xinyu looked at him. "Who paid for the shadow study?" A pause. Liang Hao turned a page in his folder. "It was an internal research investment. You absorbed the cost. The research had applications to other projects. It was a reasonable investment. The research had applications to one other project, the East District site, 3 years later. That's not a reasonable investment by any commercial metric I'm aware of." "Your thesis is about transparency as architectural intention," Liang Hao said, without looking up. "The cultural center is the clearest example of that intention I've built. I thought it would be useful." Xinyu looked at the internal photograph still open on his terminal. The even, sourceless light. The building that had solved for its own problem, before anyone inside it would ever know there had been a problem to solve. "It's in my thesis now," Xinyu said. "I know." Something in Liang Hao's voice. Not quite dry. Not quite warm. Occupying the same precise middle ground as everything else about him. The space between things where the structural logic actually lived. Chapter 4. Material Intention and Invisible Solutions. Xinyu stared at him. "You read Chapter 4. You submitted an updated draft to the Fellowship portal on Wednesday. The Fellowship portal review is for administrative." "I read everything that comes through." Liang Hao stopped. The same stop as before, the same surface discovering its gradient. He looked at his folder. "The draft is strong. The invisible solutions argument needed a better example than the one you had. Project 23 is the better example. You curated my thesis example. I suggested an archive folder. That's the same thing." "It is not. The practical outcome is." "Don't," Liang Hao said, and something in the single word made Xinyu stop. Not sharp. Not commanding. Just very direct, the way a load-bearing wall was direct, not asking, just being. "Don't finish that sentence." Xinyu looked at him. Liang Hao was looking at his folder, and his jaw was doing the thing you had catalogued across 11 days of the library. The thing where a decision was being made below the surface, in the structural layer where the actual weight lived. "Why not?" Xinyu said. A long pause. Outside the library windows the city sat in its mid-morning state, all movement and noise filtered to silence by the glass. "Because if you finish it," Liang Hao said carefully, "then we're talking about something other than your thesis." The library was very quiet. "Maybe we should," Xinyu said. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without checking first whether it would land well, because he'd found that checking in advance used energy he needed for other things, and the truth came out eventually anyway. But he heard it land in the room, felt the weight of it settle, and for once in his life wished he had checked. Liang Hao looked up from his folder. His expression was, Shen Yu searched his catalog and found nothing that fit exactly. Something in the load-bearing stillness had shifted. Not collapsed. Just redistributed, the weight moving to different points, changing the stress profile of the whole face. Shen Yu, he said. I know, Shen Yu said. You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to say something about the thesis, Shen Yu said. About the fellowship. About appropriate context. Yes. Those are all real things. Yes, Liang Hao said again. He closed his folder. Looked at the table between them, the two-seat gap that had been consistent across 11 library sessions, maintained with the precision of a specified tolerance. They're real things. But, Shen Yu said. There is no but. There's always a but. The but is why you said don't finish that sentence instead of just letting me finish it. Liang Hao was quiet. The specific quality of his quiet had changed. It wasn't the working quiet of two people sharing a table, it was something else, something that had more mass. How old are you? He said. 22. I'm 34. I know how old you are. It's on the company website. Something in Liang Hao's expression moved. You looked me up. You read my thesis chapters. It seemed equitable. What else is on the company website? Your educational background. Civil engineering degree, top of your cohort. 3 years post-graduation in project management before the first independent commission. The 2009 building. Shen Yu looked at his terminal. No personal information. No interviews about anything except building specifications and development philosophy. One photograph, which looks like it was taken against your will. The non-smile. Definite this time, brief but real, there and gone before it had fully decided to exist. It was taken against my will. You look like someone asked you to do something unreasonable. They asked me to stand in front of the East Tower and look approachable. How did that go? Poorly. Shen Yu looked at him. Liang Hao was looking back. The two-seat gap between them was exactly what it had always been, maintained with the same precision it had always been maintained with, and it felt completely different from how it had felt 11 days ago. I'm going to finish my thesis, Shen Yu said. I have 8 weeks. The draft is at 70%. I need to complete the material analysis, the case study chapter, and the conclusion. I have a working title and a strong argument and 2 excellent examples, one of which you suggested. Yes, Liang Hao said. And while I'm doing that, Shen Yu continued, I'm going to keep coming to this library, because the archive is exceptional and the research access is directly relevant to my work, and I found the bracket installation sequence more clarifying than any academic paper I've read this year. Yes, Liang Hao said, more carefully. And you're going to keep reading my thesis drafts when they come through the fellowship portal, Shen Yu said. Because you clearly are anyway, and we might as well acknowledge it. That's. And we're going to talk about buildings, Shen Yu said. The way we've been talking about buildings. Because that's what we do here and it's useful, and I don't want to stop. Liang Hao looked at him steadily. And, Shen Yu said. In 8 weeks when my thesis is submitted, I'll be a graduate. Not a fellow. Not a student. He held Liang Hao's gaze. And then we can talk about the other thing. If it's still relevant. The silence that followed had a texture Shen Yu couldn't name. Not uncomfortable. Not easy. Something in between, something that required both of them to hold it without letting it fall. 8 weeks is a long time, Liang Hao said finally. 8 weeks is 8 weeks, Shen Yu said. I've been building a model for a year. I know how to wait for the right conditions. Liang Hao looked at him for a long moment. Something in his expression was doing the calculation. The careful, thorough kind, the one you did 3 times at different times of day before you made the decision. The conclusion chapter, he said eventually. Your current draft ends the transparency argument too early. It reaches the observation and stops. It needs one more step. Shen Yu looked at him. What step? What the transparency is for, Liang Hao said. You've argued that building something meant to be seen through is an intention, a choice made before observation begins. But the conclusion needs to answer the question of why anyone would make that choice. What they're hoping the observer will see. Shen Yu thought about the cultural center. The even light. The 47-page shadow study that no one inside the building would ever know existed. What are they hoping the observer will see? He said. That's your conclusion, Liang Hao said. I'm not writing it for you. You've been writing it for me all month. I've been suggesting archive folders. That's... Don't, Liang Hao said, but this time it was different. This time the word had something in it that the first time hadn't. Softer. More specific. The difference between a structural instruction and a personal one. Shen Yu stopped. They looked at each other across 2 seats of specified tolerance. 8 weeks, Liang Hao said. 8 weeks, Shen Yu confirmed. Liang Hao opened his folder. Shen Yu turned to his terminal. The library settled back into its working quiet, the same surface as before, the same even light through the glass ceiling. Except the load distribution had changed. Both of them knew where the weight was now. Both of them were holding it. Shen Yu opened his conclusion chapter. Read the last paragraph he'd written. Read it again. Deleted the last 3 sentences and started over. He stayed until 6. Left when the library closed, the same as always, the keycard in his pocket and his bag over his shoulder, and his laptop with a conclusion chapter that was 400 words longer than it had been that morning. All 400 of them circling a question he hadn't known was the center of the argument until someone had told him to find it. What the transparency is for. What they're hoping the observer will see. He walked through the lobby with its steel letter name in the floor. Liang Hao. Founder. 3 centimeters deep. The kind of permanence that wasn't a statement. He stopped. Looked at the lettering the way he'd looked at it his first visit, when it had been a building's identification and nothing more. He looked at it now. The lobby was primarily glass. 3 faces of it, north, east and south, the west face being the solid service core. You could stand in the center of the lobby and see out on 3 sides, and 3 sides could see in. This had been a choice. This had been made before the building existed, in planning documents, in the glass specification, in the decision about which face would be solid, and which would be transparent. Someone had decided this building would be visible from 3 sides, before anyone was watching. Shen Yu looked at the steel lettering in the floor. Looked at the 3 glass faces. Thought about a man who had spent 4 years measuring other people's buildings before he had the power to build his own. Who kept his failure reports where fellows could find them. Who spent 8 months on a shadow study for a building he'd taken at reduced fee, and absorbed the cost because the building needed it. Who read thesis drafts when they came through the portal and suggested archive folders. Who said 8 weeks like a man who knew how to wait for right conditions too. What are they hoping the observer will see? Shen Yu stood in the lobby for another moment. Then he went home, opened his laptop, and wrote the best 400 words of his thesis. Chapter 5. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Not to the fellowship portal. Not to his student email. To his personal address, which Shen Yu had not given to anyone at Liang Holdings, which meant it had come from the visitor logged the same way the first text message had, efficiently, without apology, from someone who had decided the information was necessary and acquired it accordingly. He stared at it for a long time. Liang Holdings Annual Development Dinner. Thursday, 7 p.m. Rooftop, Liang Tower. Fellowship recipients are invited to attend as representatives of the company's research investment. Dress, formal. RSVP by Wednesday noon. Below the formal text, no handwriting this time. Just a second line of the same font, added as a postscript, which somehow made it more deliberate rather than less. The East District project will be presented. Dr. Fong is speaking about the bracket specification. Xin Yu read this postscript twice. Set his laptop aside. Picked it up again. Lin Jie, across the room, said without looking up. Your face is doing a thing. My face is not doing a thing. Your left hand is doing the stress tap and you're reading the same email for the third time. Shen Yu put his left hand flat on the desk. It's a fellowship event. What kind of fellowship event? A dinner. What kind of dinner? The annual development dinner. For Liang Holdings. He paused. It's on the rooftop. Lin Jie put down his pencil. This time he didn't pick it up again. He turned in his chair and looked at Shen Yu with the full, undivided attention of a man who had been patient for 3 weeks and had reached his limit. Shen Yu. It's a legitimate professional event. I'm sure it is. Dr. Fong is speaking. About the bracket specification. Which is directly relevant to my thesis, yes, Lin Jie said. Everything is directly relevant to your thesis. The library is relevant to your thesis. The site visits are relevant to your thesis. The fact that you've started eating actual meals is probably also relevant to your thesis. Shen Yu said nothing. He's 12 years older than you, Lin Jie said carefully. Not unkindly. I know how old he is. He runs a company that is by all public accounts. Lin Jie paused, searching for the precise word. Significant. Yes. And by some accounts that are less public. Lin Jie. I'm just. I know, Shen Yu said. I know what you're saying. Lin Jie looked at him for a moment. Do you? Shen Yu looked at his laptop screen. At the invitation. At the postscript that was doing the same thing the late-night messages did, the same thing the pre-entered terminal credentials did, and the coffee cups and the suggested archive folders, being useful in a way that was also something else, layered the way buildings were layered, the surface function concealing and revealing the structural intention simultaneously. He said 8 weeks, Shen Yu said. Lin Jie was quiet. He said it the way you say a specification, Shen Yu continued. Like it was a measurement. A thing to be maintained until the conditions were right. And you think the conditions are what, exactly? Relevant to this dinner. I think Dr. Fong is speaking about the bracket specification, Shen Yu said. And I think the East District project connects directly to my case study chapter, and I think I'm going to RSVP yes. Lin Jie picked up his pencil. Looked at it. Set it down one more time. Wear the good jacket. I don't own a good jacket. Then buy one, Lin Jie said. Because apparently we've reached that chapter. He bought a jacket. This felt significant in a way he didn't examine too closely. He went to a shop near the university that sold things at a price point for people who needed to look professional occasionally rather than permanently, and he stood in front of a mirror in a dark jacket that fit correctly across the shoulders and thought about structural load paths and said to the sales assistant, I'll take it. On Thursday evening he stood in the elevator of Liang Tower at 6:52 p.m. going up to the rooftop, in the jacket, with his name on the guest list and Dr. Fong's bracket presentation in his bag, because he'd asked for an advance copy through the fellowship portal, and received it within the hour, annotated with 3 marginal notes in handwriting he now recognized. The elevator opened. The rooftop was not what he'd expected. He'd expected something corporate. Clean and impressive and designed to communicate success to people who already knew about success. What he found instead was a space that had clearly been designed to communicate the city. The glass balustrade at the perimeter completely uninterrupted, the lighting low enough that it didn't compete with the skyline, the furniture minimal, the whole thing oriented outward rather than inward. The building was not the point up here. The city was the point. Shen Yu stood at the elevator entrance and looked at this for a moment, recalibrating. The balustrade specification, said a voice beside him, was argued over for 4 months. He turned. Dr. Fong, holding a glass of wine, in the kind of understated formal where that suggested she owned one such outfit, and it had served her well for years. She looked at the glass perimeter with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who had been on the right side of the argument. The original design had a solid parapet, she continued. 3 engineers, including myself, said the glass balustrade was the right choice. 2 said it was a structural liability. Who won? We did. Clearly. She nodded toward the perimeter. The city is the point up here. That was the original intention. It would be criminal to interrupt it with a parapet. Xinyu looked at the uninterrupted skyline, thought about intention and the decisions made before the building existed. Is the specification in the archive? Everything is in the archive. She glanced at him sideways. You've been spending time in it. The fellowship includes access. The fellowship includes access, she agreed, in a tone that meant something adjacent to what he'd said but not identical. How is the thesis? 8 weeks from submission. Strong. Getting stronger. Dr. Fong nodded, with the specific satisfaction of a woman who had sorted someone into a category and was being proven right. Good. The East District case study will help. Come find me before my presentation. There are load diagrams I didn't include in the public version that you should see. She walked away. Xinyu watched her go and thought about a world in which everyone communicated in load diagrams and found it, briefly and honestly, appealing. He took a glass from a passing tray and walked toward the east perimeter. Below him the city spread in the specific way it only looked from height, the individual density resolving into pattern, the movement becoming legible, the whole thing comprehensible in a way it wasn't from inside it. He stood there for 4 minutes before he became aware of someone at his shoulder. He had catalogued enough of Liang Hao's physical presence across the past weeks to recognize it without looking. The specific weight of it. The way the air organized slightly differently. The city, Xinyu said. The city, Liang Hao agreed. They stood at the east perimeter looking out. Below them was the East District site, visible from here, the steel frame a darker geometry against the lit surroundings, the east face glass panels catching the ambient light and giving it back changed. You can see the installation from here, Xinyu said. I know. I designed the rooftop orientation so you could. Xinyu turned to look at him. Liang Hao was in black, jacket, shirt, the same precision that appeared in his construction were translated into formal context. He was looking at the East District site with an expression you had seen before, the one that appeared when he looked at buildings he had made. Proprietary and critical simultaneously, the way you looked at a thing you were responsible for. You oriented the rooftop to face the current project, Xinyu said. I orient the rooftop to face whatever is being built, Liang Hao said. It changes. This season it's the East District. He paused. Before that it was the Cultural Center. The Gradient Glass Project. You can't see the gradient from outside at night. The light equalization only works internally. He turned to look at it anyway. But I know it's there. Xinyu looked at him looking at an invisible effect in a building a kilometer away, and felt the specific sensation of the load distribution shifting again. The weight moving to the new points. The stress profile changing. You invited me to a professional event, Xinyu said. The fellowship recipients are invited to. You wrote a postscript about Dr. Fong's bracket presentation. It's relevant to your... Liang Hao. He stopped. Looked at Xinyu. In the low rooftop lighting his expression was doing the thing that the library light caught differently from the site light. The gradient revealing itself, the surface opacity varying with conditions. 4 weeks, Xinyu said. What? You said 8 weeks. It's been 4 weeks. We're halfway. A pause. I'm aware of how many weeks it's been, Liang Hao said. I'm just noting the progress, Xinyu said. Structural update. The thesis is at 80%. The case study chapter is drafted. The conclusion is in progress. I read the latest draft. I know you did. You left a comment in the portal about the invisible solutions section. The section needed tightening. The section was fine. The section was good, Liang Hao said, with the precision of someone who found the difference between fine and good important. It could be better. Everything can be better. That's not a useful standard. It can be better in a specific way, Liang Hao said. The invisible solutions argument relies on the observer eventually discovering the intention. The gradient glass, the shadow study, the bracket specification. You argue that these are invisible but discoverable. That the transparency is in the bones, not the surface, and a careful observer will find it. Yes. But you haven't answered why that matters. Why the builder would want the careful observer to find it. What the builder is communicating. Shen Yu looked at him. I told you that was in progress. I know. Liang Hao looked out at the city. I'm not asking for the thesis answer. I'm asking. He stopped. Something in the construction of the sentence was giving him difficulty. The way a specification gave difficulty, when the constraints were genuinely in tension with each other, and there was no clean solution. I'm asking the question. The rooftop was filling around them, voices and the movement of a professional event in its early stages, people finding each other, the specific social physics of a room where everyone knew roughly what everyone else was worth. Shen Yu was aware of it peripherally, the way you were aware of ambient noise on a site. Present, but not the point. Why does the builder want the careful observer to find it? Shen Yu said. Yes. Because the alternative is building something opaque, Shen Yu said slowly. And opacity is a choice too. A building that doesn't want to be read, that's also an intention. The transparency is the statement that you'd rather be understood than impressive. Liang Hao was very still beside him. The careful observer, Shen Yu continued, is the person the builder is building for. Not the general audience. Not the person who walks past and notes that the building is significant. The person who stops and touches the corner bracket and feels the temperature differential. He paused. The builder is saying, there is something here for the person who looks carefully enough to find it. The city below them did its city thing. Moved and lit, and existed in its comprehensible from-height pattern. That's your conclusion, Liang Hao said. His voice was level. Careful. The way it was when a decision had been made in the structural layer, and was being expressed at the surface with full control. I know, Shen Yu said. I figured it out in the lobby. The 3 glass faces. When? The same day you told me to find it. Something in Liang Hao's expression. The gradient revealing in low light. You didn't tell me, he said. You didn't ask. Why didn't you? Because, Shen Yu said. I wanted to know if you'd get there anyway. A long pause. And? Liang Hao said. Shen Yu looked at him. At the expression that had been doing calculations since the moment he'd walked up to a man on a rooftop, who was looking at an invisible effect in a building a kilometer away. And you did. 4 minutes ago. Without me pointing you there. The crowd behind them had completed its social physics, found its groupings, settled into its conversations, generated its professional ambient noise. 2 people at the east perimeter looking at the city were unremarkable in it. Dr. Fang's presentation is in 20 minutes, Liang Hao said. I know. She told me to find her for the load diagrams. The load diagrams are important. I know they're important. The case study chapter will be stronger with Liang Hao, Shen Yu said. He stopped. 4 more weeks, Shen Yu said. I'm not changing the timeline. The thesis needs to be right. I know. But I came to the dinner. Yes, Liang Hao said. You did. In a new jacket. A pause. Liang Hao looked at him properly then. Not the peripheral awareness that had been operating since they both arrived at the perimeter, but directly, the full assessment. Yes, he said. New jacket. The shoulder fit is better than my usual. Yes, Liang Hao said again, quieter. It is. They stood at the east perimeter for another moment. The East District site below them, the invisible gradient glass a kilometer away, the city doing its legible from height pattern in every direction. I should find Dr. Fong, Xinyu said. I should speak to the investors, Liang Hao said. Neither of them moved for approximately 4 seconds. Then Xinyu stepped back from the perimeter. The load diagrams are in the unpublished version of her presentation. I know. I approved the presentation. Of course you did. Xinyu looked at him one more time, the rooftop light doing something specific to the gradient in his expression, the variable opacity visible, if you were looking carefully enough and standing close enough, and had been paying the right kind of attention for long enough. The conclusion chapter will be finished by next week. Good, Liang Hao said. I'll submit it through the portal. I'll read it when it comes through. I know you will, Xinyu said. He went to find Dr. Fong. Behind him, he heard Liang Hao not move for a moment before walking in the other direction. Dr. Fong's presentation was excellent. The unpublished load diagrams were, as promised, better than the public version. 3 additional stress analysis models that showed the bracket behavior under simultaneous thermal and wind load, which was exactly the multivariable condition Shenyu's case study chapter had been missing. He stood at the side of the presentation space with his phone photographing slides, and thought about the east face panel he had touched with his hand, and the temperature differential at the corner, and the way understanding a thing physically was different from understanding it on paper. Halfway through the presentation, he became aware of Liang Hao standing across the room. Not near him. On the other side of the presentation space, between 2 investors who appeared to be asking him something, his attention apparently on them. Apparently. Xinyu looked at slide 7. The multivariable stress model. The elegant way the composite bracket distributed the combined load across the anchor point, the thermal and wind forces finding their path through the specification, and arriving at the glass panel already reduced to something manageable. He thought about a builder making a decision about what would be visible and what would be covered in the planning documents before the building existed, while covering was still possible. He thought about what the transparency was for. He knew the answer. He'd known it in the lobby. He'd written it in the conclusion chapter in 400 words that were the best of his thesis. He was going to submit it next week and defend it in 3 weeks and graduate in 4, and then he was going to have a conversation that was not about buildings. Although, he thought, looking at the stress model on the slide, it would probably still be a little bit about buildings. He photographed the last slide. Dr. Fong caught his eye across the room and gave him the specific nod of a woman who knew her load diagrams had done their job. He nodded back. Across the room, the investors had moved on. Liang Hao was standing with a different group now, in conversation, his posture the contained professional version of himself that Xinyu had filed under performance approximately 4 days into the library sessions. The same person, different surface specification. The bones were identical. Xinyu put his phone in his pocket. Looked at the east perimeter. At the city below, the East District site visible, the glass panels catching light. There is something here for the person who looks carefully enough to find it. He stayed for another hour. Talked to 2 other fellowship recipients, a postgraduate researcher from the North Campus working on acoustic specification, a structural engineering PhD student who turned out to have read Dr. Fong's published bracket paper 3 times and wanted to discuss it at length, which Xinyu was entirely willing to do. When he left at 9:30, he took the elevator down through 31 floors of library, and 43 floors of whatever the 43rd floor was, and 17 more floors below that. In the lobby, he stopped at the steel lettering. Liang Hao, founder. He looked at the 3 glass faces. The city visible on every side, the solid west face behind him, the specific choice made in the planning documents before the building existed. His phone lit up. Unknown number, which was not unknown anymore. The conclusion reads well. You know that. Xinyu looked at this message. Looked at the lobby. Typed back. You read it already? I submitted it 2 hours ago. I read things when they arrive. It's 9:30. Yes. Xinyu stood in the three-faced glass lobby and thought about 47-page shadow studies and failure reports with personal methodology sections, and a postscript about a bracket presentation, and a man who had oriented his rooftop to face the current build so he could see it from above. He typed, 3 weeks. A pause. Longer than usual. 3 weeks, came back. Xinyu put his phone in his pocket. Walked out through the east face, glass, transparent, the city on the other side, into the night. Behind him, 31 floors up, the library was dark. 43 floors up, a light was on. Chapter 6. 3 weeks was not 3 weeks. Xinyu discovered this on a Wednesday morning, 17 days before his thesis submission date, sitting in a university corridor outside the department administrator's office, reading an email that had arrived at 7:43 a.m., and had the specific quality of information that reorganizes the structure of a day before the day has properly begun. The external examiner for his thesis defense had withdrawn. Family emergency, sincere apologies. The department was working to find a replacement, but the timeline was a problem. The defense was in 3 weeks. Finding an examiner of sufficient expertise in structural glass and material specification who was available on the scheduled date was, the administrator had written with the careful language of someone managing expectations, proving challenging. Xinyu read the email. Read it again. Put his phone in his pocket and sat in the corridor and did the calculation. The examination board required 2 external examiners. One was confirmed. One was not. Without the second, the defense could not proceed on the scheduled date. If the defense was postponed, his submission date was affected, his graduation was affected, the entire structure of the 8 weeks, the timeline, the specification, the measurement he had given and received across a library table shifted. 3 weeks became something else. He sat with this for 4 minutes. Then he went into the administrator's office and asked what specifically was needed, and the administrator told him, and he went back into the corridor and stood for a moment with his hand flat against the wall the way he put his hand flat against glass panels, looking for the temperature differential, the stress point, the place where the specification was under pressure. He did not text the unknown number. He went to his studio desk, opened his laptop, started working on the conclusion chapter revisions because the thesis still needed to be right regardless of when the defense happened, and the work was always the thing he knew how to do. He did not text the unknown number for 3 days. On the 3rd day, the unknown number texted him. The fellowship office mentioned the examiner situation. There's a structural glass specialist at the National Institute who reviewed the East District specification last year. She's familiar with the material argument. I can make an introduction if it would help. Xinyu stared at this message for a long time. Then he typed, the fellowship office mentioned it. They flag academic complications for fellows. That's a thorough fellowship. Yes. Xinyu put his phone down. Picked it up. It would help. I'll send the introduction today. He set his phone face down and looked at his conclusion chapter, and thought about the specific architectural problem of a building that kept solving for your conditions before you'd fully articulated what the conditions were. The problem being that it was not, strictly, a problem. It was just a thing that required accurate labeling, so you understood what you were working with. He labeled it. Filed it in the structural diagram. Kept working. Dr. Chen arrived at the department on Friday. She was 61 years old, had written the foundational textbook on structural glass behavior that Xinyu had read twice in his 2nd year. And she looked at his thesis document with the focused attention of someone who had been thinking about this subject for 30 years, and was interested to see what someone 22 had done with it. The Invisible Solutions chapter, she said, within the first 10 minutes of their preliminary meeting. She had the document open on her tablet, annotated already in 3 colors. This is the strongest section. The East Facade Case Study or the Cultural Center? Both. But the Cultural Center argument is more original. The gradient specification as a response to the observer's experience rather than the building's performance. You're making a claim about the purpose of material choice that most structural glass literature doesn't address. She looked up. Who introduced you to Project 23? The archive, Xinyu said. Dr. Chen looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been introduced to the archive and knew it didn't curate itself. The fellowship archive. Yes. She looked back at her tablet. Made a note in the fourth color she apparently reserved for observations she wasn't ready to categorize. The conclusion needs one more step. You've identified what the transparency is for, the careful observer, the communication of intention before observation begins. But you haven't addressed the risk. Xinyu looked at her. What risk? The risk of transparency, Dr. Chen said simply. You build something meant to be seen through. You make a choice, before anyone is watching, to be legible to the careful observer. But legibility runs both ways. She set the tablet down. What does the builder expose in choosing transparency? What is the cost of the choice? The seminar room was quiet around them. Outside the window, the university courtyard was doing its mid-morning thing. Students moving between buildings, the specific unhurried pace of people between obligations. Xinyu thought about this. He thought about a boardroom on the 43rd floor, and a man who sat in it with the contained stillness of someone who had decided long ago what would be visible and what wouldn't. He thought about a company that kept its failure reports where fellows could find them. He thought about a rooftop oriented to face the current build, and late-night messages about conclusion chapters, and the two-seat gap maintained with specified tolerance across 11 library sessions before the tolerance was acknowledged to be doing something more than its stated function. The builder exposes the intention, Xinyu said slowly. If you build something transparent, if you put the failure reports in the archive, if you do the 47-page shadow study and absorb the cost, you're showing what you value. Which means you can be read. Which means the careful observer doesn't just discover the intention. They discover the builder. Dr. Chen looked at him steadily. Opacity is protection, Xinyu continued. Transparency is a decision to be known, which is a vulnerability. You're making a bet that the person looking carefully enough to find the intention is someone worth being known by. A pause. That, Dr. Chen said, is your conclusion. Xinyu looked at the table. Yes. Write it, she said. Exactly as you just said it, but in your thesis register. And then address the implication, which is that the quality of the observer matters. That the transparent building is only as good as the person doing the looking. Xinyu picked up his pen. Started writing. He wrote for 20 minutes while Dr. Chen reviewed other sections of the document. The conclusion came out in one sustained movement, the way things came when they had been ready for longer than you'd known, and just needed the right conditions to surface. He wrote about risk and vulnerability, and the specific calculus of choosing legibility over protection. He wrote about the builder and the observer as a relationship rather than a transaction. He wrote about glass and what it cost to specify it. He did not think about the 43rd floor while he was writing. He thought about almost nothing else. The defense was rescheduled for 4 days later than originally planned. 4 days. Not weeks. The timeline had shifted by 4 days, which was manageable. Which was, structurally speaking, within tolerance. The conclusion chapter was better for Dr. Chen's question. The thesis was better for the revision. 4 days was not the disaster the initial email had made it feel like. He was at his studio desk at 11:30 that night, reading the final conclusion chapter, when his phone lit up. Dr. Chen said the defense will proceed. 4-day shift. She said the document is strong. Xinyu looked at this message. Thought about the fellowship office and what it flagged and for whom. She told you. I asked. He stared at the ceiling for a moment. You asked Dr. Chen about my thesis. I asked if there were complications with the scheduling. She said the document was strong, and the defense would proceed. She's one of my examiners. She was available and qualified and familiar with the material argument. The examiner role is independent from the introduction. The two things are. Liang Hao. A pause. Yes. Did you know she would say the conclusion needed one more step? A longer pause. Long enough that Shen Yu put his phone down, looked at his conclusion chapter, picked his phone back up. No. But I thought she might ask the right question. Shen Yu read this 3 times. He thought about archive folders and annotated portal drafts and postscripts about bracket presentations. He thought about a man who had spent 18 years thinking about glass before he had the power to build with it. What is the right question, he typed. The risk of transparency, Liang Hao sent back, immediately. No pause this time. Like it had been ready. Shen Yu sat very still. You knew what the conclusion was missing, he typed. I knew what I would have asked. Why didn't you ask it? The pause this time was the longest yet. Shen Yu watched the screen. Watched the city outside his window doing its late-night reduction, movement and light at decreased volume. Because some questions change the conditions of the thing they're asked about, Liang Hao wrote. The conclusion needed to come from the work. Not from me. Shen Yu read this twice. Then he typed, the defense is in 23 days. 23 days, came back. That's not 3 weeks. No. It's 23 days. Are you counting? Another pause. Shorter. Yes, Liang Hao wrote. Aren't you? Shen Yu put his phone down. Looked at the conclusion chapter. At the paragraph about risk and the decision to be known, and the specific calculus of transparency. At the line he'd written about making a bet that the person looking carefully enough to find the intention was someone worth being known by. He picked up his phone. Yes, he typed back. He put the phone face down. Read the conclusion one more time. It was the best thing he'd written. He knew it the way he knew correct bracket specifications, not from analysis but from the physical certainty of a thing sitting right in its frame. He saved the document. Closed his laptop. His phone buzzed once more. The East District installation completes next week. The full east facade will be glazed. Dr. Fong wants to do a final thermal check on the corner brackets before sign-off. You should be there. Shen Yu smiled at his phone in the dark of his studio, which was not something he did with any regularity, and which Lin Jie was fortunately asleep and unable to observe. For the thesis, he typed. For the thesis, Liang Hao confirmed. And because you want me to see it finished, Shen Yu typed. The longest pause yet. Yes, came back. Single word. No qualifier. No reframe. Just yes. Shen Yu held his phone and looked at the word and thought about all the ways a person could specify something. The technical language and the professional language and the language that lived underneath both of them, in the bones of a thing, legible to the careful observer, built to be found. I'll be there, he typed. He put his phone down. Went to bed. Did not sleep for quite some time, which was fine, because 23 days was a measurement he could hold, and the work was nearly done, and some things were worth building correctly from the foundation up even when the timeline shifted, even when the conditions required recalculation. Especially then. The east facade was finished on a Thursday morning. Shen Yu stood on the 4th floor of the East District building with Dr. Fong, and watched the last panel seat into its brackets. The installation crew worked with the same careful, unhurried precision he'd watched on his first site visit. The gasket seal, the anchor tolerance, the 4mm gap maintained through the final movement as the panel found its position. The bracket composite at the corner. The temperature differential he could feel with his hand, even from 3 feet away, the specific quality of the cold telling him the thermal behavior was correct. Everything in specification. He watched the crew step back from the completed installation and felt the particular satisfaction of a building that had been built correctly. From the foundation up, every decision made with the right weight given to the right things, the invisible work done before anyone would see it, the 47-page logic and the absorbed cost and the 3 times walked route all present in the surface even though none of it showed. Well, Dr. Fong said beside him. Yes, Shen Yu said. She looked at him sideways. How long until the defense? 19 days. She made a sound that was not quite a comment. Turned back to the completed facade. The corner bracket specification will appear in my next published paper, with attribution to the design development process. She glanced at him. It will be cited in your thesis. It already is. Good. She capped her pen, looked at the glass. A building is finished when every decision that was made in the planning is present in the surface. Invisibly. You can't see the decisions, but you can feel them. She tapped the bracket composite lightly. Like this. Shen Yu put his hand on the glass. The even temperature. The correct differential at the corner. The thermal behavior exactly as specified. Yes, he said. She left to sign off the installation documentation. Shen Yu stayed at the glass. Behind him, footsteps. The specific weight of them. He didn't turn around. The corner bracket specification is exactly right. I know, Liang Hao said. I was here for the final anchor sequence. How long have you been here? Since 7. Shen Yu turned. Liang Hao was in sightwear, hard hat in hand, the worn elbows jacket. He looked at the completed facade with the expression Shen Yu had catalogued under proprietary and critical simultaneously, and found he'd been wrong about the category. It wasn't proprietary. It was something older. Something that looked like the relief of a man who had made a decision in planning documents years ago, and was seeing it arrive, correctly, in the surface. It's what you wanted, Shen Yu said. It's what it needed to be, Liang Hao said. The distinction apparently mattered. They stood at the completed east facade. The morning light came through correctly, diffused, even, the quality Shen Yu had photographed in the atrium at 9 p.m. on the night that had started all of this, present now in this building too, different specifications, same intention. 19 days, Shen Yu said. Liang Hao looked at him. Not at the facade. At Shen Yu. Full and direct, the complete assessment without the peripheral management. 19 days. The thesis is done. I know. The final submission came through the portal at 2 a.m. You were awake at 2 a.m. I read things when they arrive. Shen Yu looked at him. At the expression doing its variable opacity in morning sightlight, the gradient clearly visible to anyone who had been paying the right kind of attention for long enough. You read the whole thing? Yes. At 2 in the morning. Yes. And... Liang Hao looked back at the facade. His jaw was doing the decision-making thing. The structural layer working. The conclusion, he said, is the best architectural writing I've read in 5 years. Shen Yu looked at the glass. At the morning light coming through correctly. At the bracket composite holding everything in its specified position, invisibly, the decision made in planning present in the surface. The conclusion was a collaboration, he said. It was yours. Dr. Chen asked the right question because you thought she might. Shen Yu turned to look at him. You built the conditions for the conclusion, the same way you built the conditions for the light in the cultural center. Before anyone was watching. In the planning documents. Liang Hao was very still. 19 days, Shen Yu said. The defense. Then graduation. Then we have the conversation that isn't about the thesis. It might still be a little bit about buildings, Liang Hao said. Shen Yu looked at him. At the non-smile that had finally, in morning sight light, decided to exist fully. Brief and real and entirely unguarded. There long enough to be seen by someone who had been looking carefully enough for long enough. It will definitely be a little bit about buildings, Shen Yu said. The east facade caught the morning light and gave it back changed, evenly distributed, exactly as specified. Both of them saw it. Chapter 7. The morning of the defense, Shen Yu woke up at 5:30 and lay in the dark looking at the ceiling. Not from anxiety. He knew the work. He had known the work for weeks, had lived inside it long enough that the argument felt structural, load-bearing, the kind of thing that held its own weight without him actively supporting it. He could be woken in the middle of the night and asked about the gradient density specification of the cultural center, and he would answer correctly before he was fully conscious. He lay in the dark because in 19 days, which had become 16, then 12, then 4, then tonight, which was now today, a timeline he had set and held and maintained with the precision of a specified tolerance was going to expire. And he was, with the honest self-awareness that had always served him better than pretending, slightly afraid of what happened after. Not of the conversation. He knew what the conversation would be. He had known since the lobby, since the 3 glass faces, since a man had said 8 weeks like a measurement, and then counted the days. Afraid, in the specific architectural sense, of the moment between planning and construction. The gap between the decision in the document and the decision in the material. The place where intention became a thing you had to actually build with your hands, where the specification met the site conditions and you discovered whether everything you'd calculated in advance was correct. He lay in the dark and ran the calculation one more time. Then he got up, made coffee, put on the good jacket. The examination room was small and very bright. 4 people across a table, his thesis supervisor, Dr. Chen, a faculty examiner he'd worked with in second year, and the fellowship representative. The fellowship representative position had been filled, in the examination documentation, by industry specialist, Liang Holdings. Shen Yu had seen this in the paperwork 3 days ago. Had not mentioned it to anyone. Had experienced approximately 45 minutes of something that was not quite conflict of interest concerns, and not quite anticipation before arriving at the structural conclusion that the examination board had approved the panel, and the thesis stood on its own merits, and he was going to walk into that room and defend his work. He walked into the room. Liang Hao was at the far end of the table in the fellowship representative position. In the black jacket, the same one as the dinner. He looked at Shen Yu when he entered with the expression that Shen Yu had run out of architectural metaphors for, because it was not a building, it was a person, and the person was doing something that buildings did not do. Something that required different language. Shen Yu held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Nodded once. Set his document on the table and sat down. "Whenever you're ready," his supervisor said. He was ready. He presented for 31 minutes. He knew the work. The argument moved cleanly from introduction to material analysis to case studies to conclusion, each section load-bearing, each transition logical, the whole structure present in every part. He talked about the east facade of Liang Tower, and the gradient glass of the cultural center, and the bracket composite that had been specified correctly, because someone had spent 8 months on a shadow study, and absorbed the cost because the building needed it. He talked about transparency as intention, and invisible solutions, and the relationship between builder and careful observer. He talked about the risk of legibility, about opacity as protection, about the specific calculus of choosing to be known. He did not look at the end of the table while he was presenting. Not because Liang Hao was there. Because the work was the work and it required his full attention, and he had learned, in 5 years of architecture school, that the presentation of a thing and the thing itself were different, and the presentation was only honest when it forgot about the audience and focused on the argument. He presented for 31 minutes. Then he stopped. Looked up. "Questions?" his supervisor said. Dr. Chen went first. She asked about the gradient density specification, the technical implementation, the structural behavior, the load analysis under combined thermal and wind. He answered. She pushed on the anchor bracket sequence and he pushed back, because his analysis was correct, and he'd stood at the north face with his hand on a bracket that would have failed in 15 years, and he knew exactly what the specification needed to be. Dr. Chen nodded once, with the expression of someone being proven right about a category. The faculty examiner asked about the theoretical framework, the transparency as intention argument, its relationship to existing architectural philosophy, what it contributed that wasn't already in the literature. He answered. The existing literature addressed transparency as aesthetic or technical choice. His argument was about transparency as relational choice, a decision about who you were building for, what you were willing to have discovered, what the building communicated about the builder's willingness to be read. His supervisor asked about the conclusion. About the risk. The risk of transparency, Xinyu said, is also its function. The builder who chooses legibility over opacity is making a bet that the person who looks carefully enough to find the intention is worth building for. That being known by that person is worth the exposure of being known. He looked at the table. The quality of the observer determines the value of the transparency. Which means the choice to build transparently is also a choice about who you believe the careful observer will be. Silence across the table. Who is the careful observer in your argument? The faculty examiner asked. Is it a general category? A hypothetical person? Xinyu considered this. No, he said. I don't think it's general. I think the builder has a specific observer in mind. Not consciously necessarily. But the transparency is directed. The 47-page shadow study is done for someone. The failure reports are kept in the archive for someone. The decisions are made, before anyone is watching, for the person who will eventually be watching. He paused. The careful observer is whoever the builder is building toward. Another silence. Then the faculty examiner said, and in the case studies you've presented, the Liang Holdings projects, who is the builder building toward? Xinyu looked up. He met the faculty examiner's eyes. Then his supervisor's. Then Dr. Chen's. Then, for the first time since he'd sat down, the fellowship representatives. Liang Hao was looking at him with an expression that had dispensed entirely with its surface management. The gradient was fully visible in the examination room's bright, even light. The variable opacity at 0. Everything present. I think, Xinyu said carefully, that question is outside the scope of the thesis. A beat. Then Dr. Chen said, agreed. It is. And the way she said it meant she had made a note in the fourth color, and understood exactly what category it belonged to. Any further questions? His supervisor asked. There were none. They sent him out to the corridor while the panel deliberated. He stood in the corridor with his hands in his pockets and looked at the institutional wall opposite and thought about the examination room behind him, where 4 people were deciding something about his work. About the argument he had built over a year and revised and corrected, and pushed until it held its own weight. He was not worried about the outcome. The thesis was good. He knew it the way he knew correct specifications. He was thinking about the question. Who is the builder building toward? He had not answered it directly. It was outside the scope of the thesis. The thesis was about buildings and transparency, and the architecture of intention. It was not about a fellowship and a library and late-night messages about conclusion chapters, and a rooftop oriented toward the current build. But the thesis had come from those things. The argument had sharpened against that specific whetstone. The Invisible Solutions chapter existed because of an archive folder suggestion at 10:30 in the morning in a chair 2 seats down. The conclusion existed because of a question that had been held for weeks, known to be the right question, given to someone else to ask because some questions changed the conditions of the thing they were asked about. The work was the work. It stood on its own. But it had been built in specific conditions, toward a specific kind of careful attention, and the outcome was not separable from that. The door opened. His supervisor leaned out. Xinyu. They passed him with distinction. Dr. Chen's written assessment, delivered verbally, was: the Invisible Solutions argument is original, structurally rigorous, and makes a genuine contribution to the field. The conclusion is exceptionally mature for a final year thesis. The author demonstrates both technical command and theoretical reach. Distinction, without reservation. His supervisor shook his hand. The faculty examiner said something warm about the case study chapter. Dr. Chun told him the gradient glass section would be cited in her next paper, which he already knew because she'd told him 3 weeks ago, but it meant more coming after the examination. He shook 4 hands. The fellowship representatives last. Liang Hao's hand was warm, calloused at specific points from site work. He held the handshake 1 beat longer than the others. Distinction, he said. His voice was the even, controlled surface it always was in professional contexts. His eyes were not. Thank you, Xinyu said. For the fellowship. The work earned the fellowship, Liang Hao said. For the archive folders, Xinyu said. Something in Liang Hao's expression. Those were suggestions. For the 11:47 p.m. message, Xinyu said. That first one. The east facade miscalculation. Liang Hao was very still. That one changed the conditions, Xinyu said. Everything after it was built on that. Around them the examination room was reorganizing itself, his supervisor gathering documents, Dr. Chun closing her tablet, the faculty examiner heading for the door. Professional activity filling the space, producing the ambient noise of a formal process completing itself. We should, Liang Hao began. Yes, Xinyu said. We should. They walked out of the building together. Not planned. Not coordinated. Just the two of them moving in the same direction at the same pace, and neither of them adjusting to create a different outcome. The university courtyard was in its mid-morning state. Students between obligations, the specific unhurried movement of people who had nowhere urgent to be for 20 minutes. They walked through it without discussing where they were going. Xinyu noticed this. Thought it was probably diagnostic. They ended up at the east edge of the courtyard where there was a low wall and a view of the street below, and the city continuing its city operations in every direction. Not a rooftop. Not 31 floors up. Not the building and the skyline and the East District site visible on the horizon. Just a wall at the edge of a university courtyard, and the city below at ground level, and the conversation that was not about the thesis. You passed with distinction, Liang Hao said. We established that. The work is genuinely good. I know. I want to be clear that the fellowship was. Liang Hao. The examination board was independent of. Liang Hao. He stopped. I know, Xinyu said. The work is mine. The thesis stands on its own. Dr. Chen is not a person who gives distinction to work that doesn't earn it, and neither are you a person who would ask her to. He looked at the street below. I've been studying your failure reports. I know how you make decisions. A pause. You've been studying my failure reports, Liang Hao said. The 2013 foundation specification. The 2016 drainage routing decision. The 2018 curtain wall review where the contractor substituted a cheaper sealant, and you caught it in the first month, and replaced the entire installation at cost to the company, rather than waiting to see if it would hold. Xinyu looked at him. You don't let things fail if you can see the failure coming. You absorb the cost. You update the specification. You build correctly from the foundation regardless of what it takes. Liang Hao looked at him steadily. I've been watching you make decisions for 3 months, Xinyu said. I know how you make them. I know what you value and what you won't compromise on, and what you do when the conditions are harder than the planning accounted for. He paused. I know the 2013 methodology section is in the archive, because you put it there for the person who would read it carefully enough to understand it. I know the rooftop faces the current build because you need to see it from above. I know the first text message came at 11:47 because you decided to send it, but you ran the calculation 3 more times first. Liang Hao was very still. I'm the careful observer, Xinyu said. I've been finding the intention in everything you've built for 3 months. And it is, he stopped. Found the right word the way he found the right specification, not by choosing from options, but by understanding what the material needed. It's exactly what it looked like from the beginning, before I had language for it. The street below went about its business. A bus. A group of students crossing at the light. The city existing at its regular density and volume, unreduced, unaware of 2 people on a wall at a university courtyard edge doing something that had been in the planning documents for 3 months. You're 22 years old, Liang Hao said. Not as an objection. As information he was holding and examining. You were 18 with a notebook and a measuring tape, Xinyu said. And you already understood the glass logic that would be in every building you built for the next 16 years. That's different. It's not different. You knew what you were building toward before you had the power to build it. So did I. He held Liang Hao's gaze. I've known what the conclusion was since the lobby. I wrote it in 400 words the same night. I've been waiting for the right conditions. The thesis, Liang Hao said. The thesis needed to be right on its own terms, Xinyu said. It is. It was always going to be. The timeline was real. He paused. But it was also a specification. A decision made in the planning that I knew was the right one. That the work should be finished and standing on its own before anything else was built on it. Liang Hao looked at him for a long moment. The full assessment, unhurried, the way he assessed buildings he had made, proprietary and critical, and something that had been misread for weeks, months, since the first library session, and was now correctly labeled. The timeline, he said slowly, was also for me. Xinyu looked at him. Yes. You were watching me run the calculation. You run every calculation 3 times. I wanted to see if this one was different. Was it? You counted the days, Xinyu said. You told me you were counting. You don't offer that kind of information unless you've already decided what it means. Liang Hao looked at the street below. His jaw was doing the decision-making thing. The structural layer working. Except, Xinyu thought, the decision had been made a long time ago. What was happening now was the moment of construction. The specification meeting the site. The intention becoming material. The conversation that is not about the thesis, Liang Hao said. Yes. Where would you like to have it? Xinyu thought about rooftops and libraries and unfinished buildings where the bones were visible, and the decisions hadn't been covered over yet. He thought about the place where he'd understood the conclusion. The lobby, the 3 glass faces, the steel lettering in the floor. The lobby, he said. Tonight. After the building closes and the lobby is empty. Liang Hao looked at him. The lobby. 3 glass faces, Xinyu said. Transparent on every visible side. The decision made before anyone was watching. He met his eyes. I want to have the conversation in the building that was built to be seen through. A silence. Long enough to be a calculation. Then. 7 p.m., Liang Hao said. 7 p.m. He was there at 6:58. The lobby at 7 p.m. on a Thursday was emptied of its daytime occupancy. The movement and density of a working building reduced to its bones. Security at the desk. The ambient hum of a building breathing at rest. The 3 glass faces and the city on the other side, and the steel lettering in the floor, and the light that was different from the daytime light, warmer, less diffused, coming from the internal fixtures rather than the sky. Xinyu stood at the center of the lobby. Put his foot on the L of Liang. Looked up through the glass ceiling at the sky doing its evening thing. The day's light giving way to the particular deep blue that came between day and dark, the city beginning to produce its own illumination in place of the sun's. He heard the elevator. Liang Hao crossed the lobby with the unhurried purposeful gait that Xinyu had catalogued across construction sites and library sessions and a rooftop dinner. The way he moved through spaces he had built, like someone who knew where every load path was because he'd put them there. He stopped in front of Xinyu. 2 feet. Not 2 seats. The specified tolerance had changed. The lobby, he said. The lobby, Xinyu confirmed. They stood in it. 3 glass faces. The city present on every visible side, no parapet, no interruption, the decision made to be seen through before anyone was watching. I've been building toward this for 3 months, Liang Hao said. I know, Xinyu said. I've been building toward something like this for longer than 3 months, he said. Longer than I knew that was what I was doing. Xinyu thought about the first building. 2009. The glass logic already fully formed at 22. The careful, structural attention that had been looking for its right application since 18 years old, and a notebook and someone else's buildings. I know, he said again. Liang Hao looked at him the way he looked at buildings in the moment before they were finished. When every decision made in the planning was about to be present in the surface. When the specification was about to meet the material and become a thing you could stand in and be held by. You're 22, he said. You keep saying that. I keep needing to say it. Why? Because I want to be sure I'm being honest about what I am relative to what you are, Liang Hao said. 34. 12 years. The company. He stopped. The specific stop of a man who has never been particularly good at this kind of speech. Not because he lacks the precision for it, but because he has spent a long time in professional contexts where this kind of speech had no function. I want to be certain you know exactly what you're standing in front of. Shen Yu looked at him. At the expression that had been managing its surface for 3 months, and was managing nothing now. At the variable opacity at 0 in the lobby's warm light, everything present, the transparent building being transparent. I've read your failure reports, Shen Yu said. I know what I'm standing in front of. The failure reports are not. I've stood on your sites at 7 in the morning, Shen Yu said. I've seen you catch a bracket specification with your hand that would have cracked in 15 years, and update it immediately without calculation, because the calculation was already done. I've watched you walk a 4-meter route extension 3 times before making a decision. I've read a methodology section you wrote at 26 about a mistake that hadn't happened yet, and how to make sure it never would. He stopped. I've been watching you make decisions for 3 months. I know what I'm standing in front of. Liang Hao was very still. And you've been watching me, Shen Yu said. Yes. For 3 months. Yes. And before that, in the boardroom, Shen Yu said. When you decided not to, he paused. They had never talked about the boardroom. The 43rd floor. The blood on marble and the 2 bodyguards and the word that had stopped a cocked weapon. When you made a different decision than the one everyone in that room expected. Liang Hao looked at him steadily. That's a complicated conversation. I know, Shen Yu said. We'll have it. Not tonight. But we'll have it, because I'm not building on a foundation I haven't examined and neither are you. He held his gaze. That's not tonight's conversation. No, Liang Hao agreed. It's not. Tonight's conversation is this, Shen Yu said. I'm standing in the building you built to be seen through. I've seen through it. I've found everything you put in the bones before anyone was watching. And I want, he stopped. Found the word. The right one, the specific one, not chosen from options but arrived at by understanding what the material needed. I want to keep looking. For a long time. With access to the archive. Something in Liang Hao's expression broke open. Not dramatically. Quietly. The way a building settled into its foundation. A barely audible shift, a redistribution of weight to the right points, everything finding its specified position. The surface unchanged, the structure entirely different. He stepped forward. 1 step. The 2-foot gap reduced. The archive is extensive, he said. His voice was the same. The surface management intact. Everything underneath it entirely legible to the careful observer. I have time, Shen Yu said. There are projects going back 18 years. I know. I've read the index. Liang Hao looked at him. Of course you have. He raised his hand. Slowly. The same deliberate quality that appeared in every decision he made, the thoroughness, the 3 times walking. He put his hand against the side of Shen Yu's face the way Shen Yu put his hand against glass panels, looking for the temperature, the differential, the place where the specification met the material, and told you if everything was correct. His hand was warm. There are projects, he said quietly, that aren't in the archive yet. Buildings I've been designing for a long time. In notebooks. He held Shen Yu's gaze. I've been thinking about them since before I had the power to build them. Shen Yu understood that this was not about buildings. Show me, he said. The lobby was quiet around them. 3 glass faces. The city on every visible side, present and comprehensible, and lit by its own light, now that the sky had finished its transition. The steel lettering in the floor. The building built to be seen through. The decision made before anyone was watching. Everything in the bones exactly as specified. Outside, through the east face, the East District site was dark. The installation finished. The glass panels seated in their brackets, the corner composites maintaining their specified tolerance, the thermal behavior correct all the way through. Invisible now in the dark, the intention present in the surface without being legible to anyone who wasn't looking carefully enough. Through the north face, the cultural center, too far to see, the gradient glass doing its equalization in the dark for an empty building. 47 pages of shadow study. 8 months. Absorbed cost. Through the south face, the city. The street below. Everything that existed outside the building continuing to exist, unreduced, the full density and movement of a place that had been built by 100 people over a long time, every one of them making decisions and planning documents about what would be visible and what would be covered. Shen Yu stood in the lobby that had been built to be seen through. Was seen through. Completely. By someone who had been looking carefully enough for long enough, and had found everything in the bones. The lobby was quiet. Neither of them moved for a while. Neither of them needed to. Epilogue. 6 months later, Shen Yu started at Liang Holdings as a junior design consultant. Not because of the fellowship. Not because of anything except that Dr. Chun had recommended him to 3 firms, and he had chosen the one whose archive he already knew, and whose sites he had already walked, and whose lead engineer had told him, on a 4th floor east face with her hand on a bracket composite, that he could feel the specification with his hand. He had the complicated conversation about the 43rd floor. It took 4 hours and 2 evenings and 1 morning on a site where the honesty of unfinished buildings made the honesty of everything else easier. It was, as promised, complicated. It was also necessary, the way a foundation examination was necessary. You built on what was actually there, not on what you assumed was there, and the building was only as good as your willingness to look. He kept the keycard. Lin Jie said when informed. I knew since the wet shoes. That was the first night. Yes, Lin Jie said. That's what I said. Dr. Fong published her bracket specification paper. Shen Yu's thesis was cited in the 3rd paragraph of the introduction. He read this on a Tuesday morning in the Liang Tower Library, at the terminal, and said nothing about it. Liang Hao, in the chair 2 seats down, said. She cited the thesis before she cited me. She cited the thesis because the thesis was first. I developed the specification. I argued the intention. A pause. Fair, Liang Hao said. The East District building was completed in the spring. Shen Yu went to the opening. Stood in the lobby of the finished building. Interior partitions up, surfaces complete, the bones covered over, and felt the specification present in everything without being visible in anything. The light even. The corner brackets invisible inside their frames. The 4mm gap hidden behind the gasket seal. All the decisions made before anyone was watching present in the surface, discoverable by the careful observer, invisible to everyone else. He put his hand against the east face glass. Even temperature. Correct differential at the corner. The thermal behavior exactly as specified. Well, said Liang Hao, beside him. Yes, Shen Yu said. They stood in the finished building and looked through the transparent east face at the city, which was doing its city thing on the other side, moving and lit and comprehensible from the right position. The next project, Liang Hao said. Tell me. Liang Hao reached into his jacket and produced a notebook. Not a folder. Not a tablet. A notebook, worn at the corners, filled with the handwriting Shen Yu recognized as the person underneath the surface management. He held it out. Shen Yu took it. Opened it to the first page. Glass. Gradient. Load analysis in the margins. The thermal behavior worked out in pencil. The bones of a building that didn't exist yet legible on the page for the person who knew how to read it. The intention present before the observation had begun. He read it the way he read everything, carefully, completely, with the specific quality of attention that had been looking for this kind of material since before he'd known that was what he was doing. He read for a long time. Well, Liang Hao said eventually. Shen Yu looked up. It needs a shadow study, he said. Liang Hao looked at him. The expression entirely visible. No surface management. The gradient at 0. How long? He said. Shen Yu looked back at the notebook. At the bones of a building that would exist someday, planned correctly, built from the foundation up, every decision made with the right weight given to the right things. As long as it takes, he said. We do it right. Liang Hao was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. We do. The end. Thank you for reading Behind the Glass. If Shen Yu and Liang Hao's story found you somewhere in the world, in a late-night studio on a commute, in a country we've never heard from in the comments, then the story did exactly what it was built to do. It found its careful observer. Drop your city below. Tell us where you listen this. And if you want to be the first to know when the next story begins, subscribe to the BL Story Room. The next one is already in the planning documents. See you in the next story.